Hello and welcome to this ICMI20 interview of Dr. Rebecca Owens with me, William Collins and Mike Buchanan. Rebecca, or Becci, is a lecturer in psychology at the University of Sunderland with an academic background in psychology and evolutionary psychology. She's a chartered member of the British Psychological Society and a senior fellow of the Higher Education Academy. Her research interests include the different mating behaviours of the sexes, body image and identity, and of particular interest to our likely audience, male psychology. Becci is a member of the male psychology section of the British Psychological Society. She co-authored a chapter within the Palgrave Handbook of Male Psychology on the subject of testosterone, and this year she started what I believe is the first university course on male psychology in the UK. So Becci, welcome.
Hi, thank you.
Can I kick off the questions then with a question about evolutionary psychology?
Yes.
And why is it that so many people, and bright people as well, seem to be so skeptical of evolutionary psychology?
I think people struggle to understand the concept of evolutionary psychology, really, and I think people feel that it's a lot about genetic determinism, which it's not. And I think a lot of people also think it seems really far removed. But what I suggest to people is that, you see physically how we have evolved. Why would our psychology be any different? So a lot of the kind of pushback about evolutionary psychology, I don't really understand where it comes from, to be honest. I think it's a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of, I guess historically, religious pushback as well. People didn't want to think about anything other than a creationist perspective. And also people didn't want to think of us as being animals, but of course we are animals. So we're no different from any other animals in that sense, that we're subject to evolutionary processes.
I wonder if sorry, Rick, were you about to say something?
No, you carry on, Mike.
Yes, this is something that fascinates me. I'm a big admirer of Steven Pinker, the Harvard psychology professor, and his book, The Blank Slate, was absolutely fascinating. But of course, I mean, feminists to this day, I mean, they tend not to push the blank slate theory so explicitly, but they will say that plasticity makes up for any differences in the brain. And there's a Dutch neuroscientist who goes by the slightly unfortunate name of Dick Swab.
I have heard of him.
And he says it's either hundreds or thousands of known differences between gender-typical male and female brains. So whenever you raise this issue of male and female brains with a feminist, they have a go-to book. Feminists have a go-to book for everything, and there's two or three in this case. One of them is Cordelia Fine's Delusions of Gender.
Oh yes.
And I read a book recently, Human Diversity by Professor Charles Murray, and he says people working in the field of neuroscience laugh at Cordelia Fine. Mm-hmm. She's basically saying that yes, there are differences, but they don't matter because the human brain is so plastic that it's non, So I wonder if you have any thoughts on, if you like, male and female gender typical brains.
I mean, I think that men and women have undergone different evolutionary processes and undergone different evolutionary selection pressures throughout our evolutionary history. Just from a physiological perspective, I don't know. I'm not a biological or neuroscientist or anything like that. So my colleague, I think, would say that, if you looked physiologically, there aren't any real differences in our brain, but there are some small differences. But I feel like that just says everything there is about sex differences, really. There are an awful lot of similarities between men and women, but there are differences. And even if they are small differences, they are very meaningful, and they have big repercussions, I guess. They have big consequences for differences. So I think combined with our evolutionary history and sex differences in that sense, and of course, you know, reproductively speaking, we're different as well. And that has a relationship with our psychology as well. I think we've got to take into account those differences. And yes, neuroplasticity is a thing. I don't think it can explain all of the differences. I don't think it can just wipe those things out at all.
No, we have something that Rick will be very aware of, is I think it's called the Swedish Paradox. And basically it's the phenomenon where the more gender equal the society and the more choice that women have in their choices of professions, or choice not to work, the more they will go into gender typical fields.
Yeah.
So in Iran you'll have plenty of female physicists, and in Sweden very, very few. And feminists call that a paradox. I mean, to any men's rights activist, it's not a paradox. It's blindingly obvious.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Can I change the subject just slightly, although maybe it isn't really changing the subject? The male section of the British Psychological Society is very new. It's only, what, 2 years old now, something like that. And it had a rocky ride, didn't it, to being approved? I think that the first time, if I remember correctly, although there was a majority in favour, they then moved the goalposts and said, oh no, 50% isn't enough, you need something else, 70% or something.
That's right.
So there seemed to be, I was getting the impression, as an outsider, mind you, but I got the impression there was quite a lot of pushback against it from within the BPS. Why do you think that is?
Well, I don't know if it did actually come from within the BPS or not, but I was thinking about this and I thought the BPS is comprised of other psychologists and academics working in the field. And we see a lot of pushback against male psychology within our profession anyway. So if it did come from within the BPS, I think that probably isn't surprising, because a lot of people do oppose it within the BPS and without the BPS, for reasons that I don't agree with, obviously, but everyone's different, I guess.
Yeah, but is it an academically based objection or something else?
I don't think it is an academically based objection, to be honest, because I think it's only equitable to have a male psychology section of the BPS. And I don't understand why anybody would logically oppose it for anything other than ideological concerns, really. I mean, if anyone wanted to try and, argue against that or explain why that's not the case, then I'd be interested to hear that. But I don't understand any academic perspective on why we wouldn't have a male psychology section.
Yeah, that's the worrying thing, really, that it's an example of ideology or politics trumping the academic within the academic arena, which is not good, is it?
No, it's not at all. No.
Can I say that there's also, of course, a sex issue here, in that I have a female relative who got a doctorate in psychology, 15 years ago, I think, and well over 90% of her year's intake of students, and later, graduates and so on, were female. It seems to be a very female-dominated field, and amazingly, there are no government initiatives to increase the number of male psychologists. It's very surprising. Whereas if you look at engineering, exactly the opposite. I mean, the government throws tens of millions of pounds at that. So is it simply, if you like, in part?
If I can interrupt at that point, of course, it's not just the government, it's also the professional bodies. Because being an engineer, I know the Institute of Mechanical Engineers, for example, and the Institute of Physics have both been very vociferous and active for not years, but decades in promoting women in physics and engineering. Whereas what we have in psychology is we've just illustrated by the discussion of the BPS and the rocky road to getting a male section. So it's not just government, it's also from within the professional bodies themselves distressing.
Yeah.
So is it? Sorry, Becky, I'm not sure I asked the question there, but I guess what I'm coming to is this in part a manifestation of female narcissism, that women tend to be interested in women's issues and what affects women, and they really, are not interested in despite being psychologists, they are naturally less interested in men and men's issues.
It's an interesting perspective on it. I think for a lot of people, it comes from the historical place of female oppression and this kind of almost aggressive pushback against that. And I can understand that to an extent. I mean, women have been oppressed historically, but some women have. But there's also a lot of men who have, and that's where I get stuck, that there's this fight from women who go, women have been historically oppressed, throughout history, and it's like, well, not all women have, and likewise not all men have done the oppressing. Some women have oppressed, some men have oppressed. I don't think it's a gender issue, is where I'm trying to get at. I don't think that is a gender issue, but I think that kind of misperspective of it, that misunderstanding of it, fuels a lot of the hate and the opposition and the pushback against male psychology and the pushing for looking at women and let's push women forward. This kind of misunderstanding of women being disadvantaged historically, whereas men have had, the pick of their playing field, which again, that's not something I agree with. But it's that, I guess, a superficial perspective that people don't necessarily question. They don't necessarily look underneath that perspective and go, well, what about all of these other men who, you're not thinking about that in a kind of logical way. I'm getting off on a tangent there, aren't I?
No, I think not. No, far from it. I think that's absolutely right. I think it's a distorted view of history is what drives a lot of these opinions, that they're just not soundly based. They're based on a mythological view of history.
Yes.
But it strikes me that this issue that Mike's raised about the percentage, the sex ratio in psychology, which is very skewed to women. We know
it
that.
Is.
It's apparent even at A level, by the way. I've just been looking at the stats, so it's not just university. So it's probably something innate, which is fair enough. But it strikes me there's an interesting question here, because you have just started this male psychology course, and I think I'm right in saying it's the first one in the UK.
It's
maybe the first one in the world. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But what sort of sex? Well, what sort of numbers are you getting in that course, and what's the sex ratio there? Is it still massively biased towards women?
It is, yes. We've got about 40 students in that cohort, and it is still biased towards women, which again perhaps isn't very surprising, because every year group that we have, undergraduate and postgraduate, it's all biased towards women, and that's something that we've been looking at in our Athena Swan process, our Athena Swan self-assessment team. So the chair of our self-assessment team for psychology, the School of Psychology, she's really interested in trying to increase the visibility of psychology to men, and we also have another colleague in engineering as well, and they were going to look at the differences in these kind of government initiatives that you were talking about before, about promoting women into STEM, and what about men into things like psychology. And we kind of tried to do a lot of research about why this sex difference might come about. And we thought it seemed to be that some of it, women didn't seem to really understand that psychology is a science, and that we do have to do a lot of numbers and...
That's funny.
We still have to do a lot of that stuff in it. I mean, there are some aspects of psychology that don't work with numbers, obviously, but there's still that rigorous process there that you've got to stick to. And from a male perspective, a lot of men aren't aware that is the case. And the men that do come into the courses say usually that they really enjoy that aspect of it, and that they weren't aware just how quite rigorous it was going to be. And then a lot of the women say, I didn't realise that it was going to be like this, and it really put us off. So there's something there about communicating it.
I didn't realise I was going to have to understand the Whitney U test and the Cronbach alpha and all that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Didn't realise we would have to do that by hand or anything.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there does seem to be that split, doesn't there, between the people that think it's just about people and it's all warm and cuddly and fuzzy and fluffy,
sitting around
and
on
the hardline empiricists that say, "Give me the data."
Yes,
what's the significance?
Exactly.
Yeah. The paper that you wrote with John Barry in the Palgrave Handbook on testosterone was very interesting. I reread it again yesterday, and so testosterone is one of those subjects which is almost universally misunderstood, isn't it? So here's my question. Does testosterone increase aggression or dominance or status seeking? And are these things in any case good or bad?
In men, it increases dominance striving, I guess. And I don't think that can be seen as good or bad, because I think it's real context dependent. So in that chapter, I talk about the mouse model and how, yes, status seeking, dominance striving probably does look aggressive in other species, but in humans, obviously, we're a lot more complex, and there are different ways of establishing dominance. And one of the best ways I think that we see this is in terms of it's not just a bad thing kind of thing, is competitive altruism. And striving to be the best cooperator. So I don't think we can say that it's just aggressive and it's fighting and it's violence and it's putting yourself up at the expense of everybody else. That's too much of a simplistic, misunderstood view. It's about putting yourself in the best position you can, not necessarily at the expense of other people, because cooperating has always been important in human evolutionary history, and it still is. It's not just it's not a selfish, aggressive thing, and we will see examples of this where people will compete to be the best cooperator, for example.
Yeah, well, getting on in large organisations is sort of an example of that. It's a mixture of selfish competition and satisfying the corporation as a whole. So it's a mixture of the two things. And would you agree with me if I suggested that this aspect of men, which is particular to men because it's encouraged by testosterone, to be competitive and hierarchical, because competition and striving generates hierarchy, and hierarchy is just really another name for inequality, isn't it? This is what brings the masculine into apparent conflict with those who put all priority on equality at all costs.
That's a really good point. I think that's a really interesting point. And like I said, it's not the only reason why, but I don't agree with equality of outcomes for this reason, really, because you see, you can have equality of opportunity and it results in a hierarchy in some places, but I just think it doesn't have to be a moralistic hierarchy. It doesn't have to say that this puts anybody moralistically above or below anybody else. It just is. It's just these things just are, and I don't understand why people aren't okay with that, I guess.
I always think it would help if we had a more predictive quantitative theory of sociology, so that we could examine in some way objectively the effect of these things, because it seems to me, I mean, the obvious example is like in communist regimes where they try and enforce rigorous equality, all that happens is they level everyone down, because you can't make everyone rich, but you can make everyone poor. You can't make everyone brilliant, but you can make everyone stupid.
Exactly.
And so by eliminating hierarchy and competition or capitalism or whatever, you sort of also eliminate drive. And there's a direct parallel of this in physics, because in physics, everything is generated by potential difference. difference.
Yeah.
You know, because it's that potential difference is force, which creates motion and makes everything happen. And if potential was uniform, nothing would happen. It would be status and death. And it seems to me there's probably an equivalent to that in sociology, if somebody could actually put their finger on it.
That's it. I mean, a couple of interesting things popped into my head there listening to you talk. And the first one was about Steven Pinker saying, you know, in his opposition of the blank slate theory of human development, blank slates don't do anything, but human babies are equipped to develop, to learn, and we have these kind of sensitive periods in which we will learn certain things much quicker than we will at certain other points in our lives, like, you know, a sensitive period for language development, for example, where that will bloom. So there's those differences. There's something there that kind of catalysts our development and our learning. What was the other thing that just popped into my head? I can't even. About cooperation. So, you know, if we had a truly equal society where everybody was equal and everybody cooperated and helped out and everything like that, as you see in communist societies, that is rife for taken down. It takes for just a minority of people to come in and just take that down and exploit everybody's cooperation and altruism, and it doesn't. That's why it's not sustainable in a society. Yeah. We can't maintain that.
Yeah, in game theory terms, it's the reneger, the person who reneges on a cooperative system can benefit personally, and so it's always unstable. And you can stabilize it by making sure there are sanctions against people who renege that are sufficiently strong, which is normally instigated through social shaming and guilt.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, you know, even from an evolutionary perspective, you can see how you know, defecting rather than cooperating can be an attractive strategy for some people, but at a society level, it just doesn't work for reasons you've just said very nicely and articulately.
Yeah, let's just get back to testosterone, because there's some more interesting stuff on that. One of the things I've heard about, I don't know if there's sound data to back it up, is that men's testosterone levels tend to fall after a child is born. Is that true? And if so, why do you think that is?
Yes, there is evidence that suggests that testosterone levels decrease in men once they are partnered, and then furthermore once they become fathers. And the suggestion is that is to help, you know, to reduce the kind of dominance-seeking motives in men, so that they'll invest in their children, because there's a real strong evolutionary pressure on human men to invest in their children, because we're horrible children, really. We're really costly. We need a lot of investment. So to try and get the men to stick around and invest in their children, really. So they've got this hormonal correlate, I guess, it's being called a physiological correlate of mate and effort. Testosterone will be higher to help motivate mating behaviours, and it reduces to help motivate paternal behaviours and provisioning behaviours. Yeah.
I mean, it makes sense from the EvoPsych point of view, doesn't it? But as most things tend to, but it's mysteriously people still look at it askance.
Yeah.
So here's a hypothetical question for you then. Leaving aside purely physical medical issues, if there was a sudden dramatic decrease in men's testosterone levels overnight, all men, what do you think would happen in sort of psychology, sociology?
That's really interesting. I think that there would be a worldwide lack of motivation to do anything. To be honest, I think things wouldn't be pushed. Things would just be maintained. Nothing would be pushed out of the comfort zone. Nothing truly creative or beautiful would be made. Everything would just tick along quite nicely and boring. is what I think.
Yeah, that what do they call it? Not the Ig Nobel Prize, the other one where they give a prize for people who do really, really stupid things. It would become dramatically short of candidates, wouldn't it? And all those people that do base jumping and jump off cliffs in wingsuits and all that, there wouldn't be so many of them anymore.
No, there wouldn't. There wouldn't.
Not that I must be lacking in testosterone because I've never felt tempted to do any of those things. Erin Pitsey has a really good way of expressing that. If testosterone was, masculinity was really suppressed, she said we'd all drown in estrogen soup.
Delightful.
Was it, Rick, can I ask, was it Camille Paglia who said that if women had been in charge of civilization, we'd all still be living in caves, but the cushions would be amazing?
Yeah, it was, yeah. Oh, mind you, it'd be gay men doing the cushions,
Very good. Okay. Just before I come on to my next question, Becci, I'd just like to bring up, I've long had an interest in intersex competition. And there's a theory which drives feminism up the wall, and it's called preference theory, and it was published in a book in the year 2000 by Dr. Catherine Hakim, a world-renowned sociologist, and she researched men and women's orientation in a number of countries to work, and if you like, how work-centered they were, and she basically found that 4 in 7 British men were work-centered, and only 1 in 7 British women is work-centered. So that, in terms of equality of I mean, you would expect an 80-20 split on, let's say, major corporate boards, just down to work ethic. And if you had other issues, it would be nearer 90. So my own conference speech is about how and why, decade after decade, women fail to compete successfully with men at the highest levels if the playing field is level. This being the case, initiatives to deliver equality of outcome, such as Athena Swan, inevitably lead to a decline in organizational performance, and invariably at a higher cost too.
Yeah.
What is wrong with women that they seek equality of outcomes regardless of merit? And why do you think men capitulate to these demands, which, in the case of Athena Swan, must be denying many men academic careers?
I think that comes back partly again to the misunderstood kind of historical narrative, and this misunderstanding of women being historically repressed and trying to regain their status and trying to regain their perceived to be lost status and lost opportunities and things like that. But as you say, I don't agree that we could level the playing field, and it does concern me that for men and women, that if we tried to level the playing field, that we would be pushing people into something that wasn't suitable for them, whether that's just because they didn't want to, or so as you say in there about the 80-20 split, I was just talking to my students about the male variability hypothesis. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. I presume you are. I'm very familiar with everything.
Not quite.
So this the idea, that if we looked at a normal distribution, there's more men at the top and at the bottom end of the spectrum, and women tend to cluster much more around the mean. And this is in line with sexual selection perspectives as well. So on that caveat, that we would expect to see more men at that top end of the tail, maybe it's the 80-20 split that you talk about, but that we wouldn't exclude that 20% of women who would be up there as well. And that's where this equality of opportunity comes from. And so trying to push people into anything just to make it a 50-50 split. And like I said to our chair of our Athena Swan self-assessment team that I couldn't be involved in our assessment if that was what our goal was, because I wouldn't support something like that. So say, for example, if we had to make that a 50-50 gender split, and then there was less capable women who replaced more capable men because of that, we would then have to go around and do the same everywhere. So, are we going to start forcing 50% of women to enter the military and prevent some men who want to be in the military from being there, just to make it an equal ratio? Are we going to stop putting men in prison just to make sure we've got women going into prison in a 50-50 split? It doesn't stop just there. If that...
But in practice, it does stop there. That's the problem.
Yeah,
it's equality in one direction only.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, exactly.
But the entire point of Athena Swan is to do exactly that, isn't it? And so I mean, you know, huge concern about the proportion of women in engineering. Damn all interested in the proportion of men in psychology. So so I mean, there's a lot of funding going behind these things, and my understanding is that research grants are denied to maybe departments or individuals who don't get the requisite number of stars. So there's a lot of pressure, aiming at this objective that we can all agree is utterly absurd.
Yeah, exactly. There is. And I mean, like I say, our Athena Swan, we made recommendations about trying to attract men into psychology. Maybe that's a little easier for us to say, because I'm in psychology. I'm not in engineering or anything, but yeah, we made recommendations about that.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, just to put my cards on the table, I don't believe in forcing equality of outcome, and that means that I'm perfectly relaxed if psychology continues to be 80% women. It's not the same to the people who are psychologists that bothers me. It's the integrity of the subject that bothers me. And so I'm very glad you're putting on a male psychology course, because the difference between engineering and psychology, in fact, the difference between the subjects that are dominated by men and those that are dominated by women is, and this is absolutely 100% correlation, is that men go for the subjects which are to do with things, and women go for the subjects that are to do with people and animals. It's a perfect split. And so it's bloody clearly innate. You don't need any more evidence than that. But I'm perfectly relaxed about that. But it does mean there's a skew in the likely, not the people, but the way the subjects are approached. Because gender's irrelevant to a lump of steel or an electron. Yes. But it's very relevant when your subject matter itself is people. Yeah. So the issue of a potential gender bias is really only on the side of the subjects which are dominated by women. And that's the sort of source of the problem. Yeah, that's a good point. And so it's a very good thing you're putting on this male psychology course. Thank because, you. I mean, you know, we all come from our own psychological background. So I don't understand the psychology of women naturally. It has to be an academic or cerebral study. And the same is very obviously true the other way around. I mean, if you're a man, you do see that you are not understood by women. And John, you know, I understand the irony that I'm a woman and I'm putting on the male psychology module, definitely. Yes, but that doesn't matter as long as you're aware of it, because after all, I'm not an electron. It doesn't stop me studying electron. But then I'm not likely to make the mistake that I am one. That's the difference. That's a good point, yes.
Sorry, just staying on this. It's absolutely inevitable that what comes out of Athena Swan is that women are getting positions ahead of better qualified men. Now, surely there must be huge resentment in academia at that reality. Is there not? I mean, are men not fuming? I don't know what men can do. I mean, nothing, I guess. But they must be angry.
That's it. There must be, and I do wonder about, you know, when people start, when you hear the statistics about, oh well, we've got nearly a 50-50 split in male and female professors or something like that, and I just think, I don't want to see those statistics. It's like you mentioned before. I want to know about the integrity of that data. Is that comparable? You know, or are we looking at something like 3 publications versus 20 publications? You know, something daft like that. I don't know. Are they comparable? Are those women and those men getting those positions based on merit? I'm not interested from a personal perspective, what the gender ratio is. I'm interested in the integrity of that. And it all, for me, comes down to the equality of opportunity. And that's why, as you said before, I'm not bothered about the gender ratio in psychology being 80-20, as long as everyone knows that it is a subject that can appeal to men as well. And it's not just a female-oriented subject. If you're interested in that, then great, come and study it. It's making sure that everyone has that opportunity to be able to do that if they want to. And then, we'll probably end up seeing what you see in Switzerland when we take those pressures off. But yeah, sorry, I'm going off on one now.
Well, a related question, I suppose. Your views are not exactly typical, I would think, of people in the academy, particularly in psychology or the humanities generally.
Yeah.
Do you find sympathetic voices there at Sunderland, or do you find your alone voice crying in the wilderness?
There's a couple of sympathetic voices, but we are very quiet, I think. And there are people who are very loud and in opposition to it.
That's an interesting question in psychology in itself. Yeah. Why is one side so loud, which seems to reflect confidence in their opinion in some way, and others like you and I tend to be a bit more reticent about expressing our opinions in public?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I always feel like I'm worried about saying the wrong thing and offending somebody, and I don't want to do that. Even, I don't want to upset anybody and say the wrong thing, because terminology seems to change quite a bit, and then I get stuck on, well, it's just semantics. I'm not really bothered about what these labels are. I'm talking about what it is that's lying underneath it. But I also think, and this might sound really awful, but there's a bit of a Dunning-Kruger aspect sometimes as well. And I think people who are less informed do typically shout an awful lot about things that they could probably be better informed about. And I don't want to be one of those people.
No, there is that as well. Yeah, I mean, it is a very difficult thing to fight, isn't it?
It is,
and because the one thing you need is tolerance of other people's opinions in order to make progress, and that seems to be what's lacking. And to some extent, we play along with that by being reticent.
Yeah.
Well, Mike isn't reticent in the least. I've noticed, but I confess I'm rather more reticent than he is.
I was going to wear my "Feminism is Cancer" T-shirt, but I thought that might not go down well. I wonder if I can ask a final question from me anyway. We've already mentioned Karen Strawn, or Girl Writes What, the legendary MRA and anti-feminist. In our 2016 International Conference on Men's Issues, she spoke on the topic of, or her talk title rather, was Toxic Femininity. And it was a very good speech, like all her speeches are. We hear a lot about toxic masculinity. Why, Becky, do you think femininity isn't under the spotlight the way that masculinity is?
I think that partly is misunderstanding of what masculinity is and what femininity is. I feel like a lot of when we hear about toxic masculinity is just a bit of a misunderstanding about what masculinity actually is. And again, it might come into the historical perspective, this misunderstood historical narrative of female oppression and male oppression, in terms of men are the ones who have been oppressing, masculinity is bad in that sense, femininity must be good because it's been oppressed. But I don't understand why that is the case either. I think there's a lot of aspects of femininity that could be considered to be toxic. I mean, personally, I don't think toxicity is something that's necessarily gendered, that's innately gendered. This perception of masculinity being toxic because it's ruthless and it's aggressive and things like that comes back to the testosterone stuff that, that's just a misunderstanding. women can be toxic, very toxic, as we're all aware of, and whether that's an aspect of femininity or whether it's just people.
Right. I just like to point out something that agitates MRAs considerably is the public perception that in domestic violence that men are overwhelmingly the perpetrators and women the victims. It's been known. I mean, there's a very good section in Rick's amazing book, The Empathy Gap. He's too modest to plug it, so I will. About a couple of major sort of studies, and the basic stats are that in straight couples, about 60% of straight couples where there's domestic violence, it's mutual. You know, sometimes a woman starts it, sometimes a man starts it. But in the 40% of the remainder where the violence is always one way, the perpetrator is twice as likely to be the woman as the man. And yet, you know, I've never in all the years I've been interested in these areas, I've never seen you always see a poster, let's say on the BBC, of a woman cowering in the corner and a man with a clenched fist or a baseball bat or something. I don't think. I mean, we managed to find one image of a battered man, but for some reason society doesn't want to accept that women can be violent and are more violent towards their partners than men.
Yeah, I agree. We've been looking at that in the male psychology module recently. We had a guest lecture from Liz Bates as well, and we did that. We were looking to see, you know, if you Google domestic violence, what pictures do you see, what support do you see, and things like that. And I think, I mean, it would be interesting to know, you know, what the stats would be a few hundred years ago. I presume we don't have that kind of data, but I wonder if this narrative around female oppression has kind of given some women carte blanche to push back a bit more. I do wonder about that if it's pushed it the other way. But yeah,
I suspect that's always been there. But I use a photo library, an online photo library, and I put in the keywords male victims of domestic violence. 7,000 images came up, all of female. They didn't have a single image of a male victim. Anyway, so that was sorry, I sort of rambled there a little bit as I talked. Sorry, we'll edit this little bit out, but I think it's time for your final question, and then after Becky's responded to that, then the outro, I think, Rick.
Yeah, well, I think I'd like to just come back to the and finish on the note of your male psychology course, because that's obviously a sort of major event that for you and for us. So can I come back to that and just ask you what sort of subjects it covers? You've mentioned domestic violence there. What other issues does it cover?
Well, we've covered biological sex differences and gender differences. We've covered parental alienation, male victims of sexual abuse, child sexual exploitation, the awareness of those aspects. We've looked at, or we're going to be looking at sex differences in, I wasn't really sure how to phrase it, but real world settings. So why men are more likely to be in the military. We looked at conscription as well. So we questioned the gendered narrative about female oppression and male oppression, to look at kind of forgotten men throughout history as well. We've looked at sex differences in exposure to trauma and in responses to trauma, and how that might impact male risk-taking and substance abuse further down the line as well. And we've had some really nice guest sessions from John Barry and Martin Seeger, and Kenny Mamarella de Cruz as well. So
excellent. Yeah, that's pretty comprehensive. I mean, I probably think of one or two other things, like the history of education is a good one, because that would be really widely misunderstood. You know, people tend to think women were not educated and men were, which is another of the massive oversimplifications. Because actually, the vast majority of both sexes were not educated, is the simple truth. Yeah, excellent. Sounds good.
Thank you.
I'll have to join. Well, thank you, Becky, for your time. We're very grateful. It's been a fascinating interview, and we wish you the best of luck and success with your new male psychology course, and keep the flag of truth and freedom flying over there in Sunderland. Well done.
Will do. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky. That was wonderful.
Thanks.
And it's a wrap.